Okay, everybody, here's learning how to do trig video number 2. And this is to support the big ideas that are in your booklets for trigonometry, which we gave to everybody before COVID-19 happened. All right, so what's going to happen? Trigonometry is pretty easy. The following steps will guide you along the way, and by the end of this video, you will be the master of the universe, or just pretty good at math. And there's some steps, and the first step is probably the most important: labeling the triangle. Well, what does that mean? Well, we always want to label the triangle from theta. So we remember yesterday, or that other video, we talked about theta. Now, theta is this character that's right in the corner, and that means the angle we're looking from. And the three words we're going to use are opposite, hypotenuse, and adjacent. So here, if we're looking from theta, we say that this is the opposite side. We'll just use an O. If we're looking, here's my square corner, that's my right angle, we know that this is my hypotenuse. So we just usually label it with an H. And adjacent is the side that connects theta and the right angle. O, H, and A. O, H, and A. Now, on the second triangle here, there's theta sitting right in the corner again, being all nice, okay? And we see that from theta over here, this would be our opposite side. Here's our little square corner, so we know that this side has to be our hypotenuse. It just has to be. It just has to be because it's the longest side, and we know that the hypotenuse is the longest side. Okay, and so this has to be adjacent over here because it's the only one left. All right, on this last triangle, there's our theta right in the corner. So looking from here, we see that this is our opposite. We see our square corner here, so this has to be hypotenuse. So that means the last side left, last leg standing, is adjacent. Now that's the first step. Is probably the most important step because everything else comes from the labeling. Remember, opposite, hypotenuse, adjacent. Okay, now step number 2 is we have to choose the appropriate trig ratio. Now, when we say a trig ratio, remember that a ratio means a comparing of one thing to another. Now, what's going to happen here is I'm just going to scroll down here a little bit and give you a little spoiler alert. So when we say we're going to compare a ratio, we might be comparing the length of the opposite to the length of the hypotenuse. Or we might be comparing the adjacent side to the hypotenuse. Or, I'm sorry, adjacent hypotenuse. Or we might be comparing adjacent to opposite. So when we say a trig ratio, we're just basically saying what is it that we're going to compare from the diagram that we're given. That's why this guy looks so confusing, because he had never heard about it before, but now that he does, game on. There are three trig ratios that we can use, but we only need one, and the one we pick depends on the information in the triangle. So the first one that we'll talk about is sine. And the ratio looks like this. Sine is equal to O divided by H. Now O stands for opposite, H stands for hypotenuse. So if our triangle tells us something about opposite and hypotenuse, we'll use the sine button. The next one is cosine. Well, cosine is basically adjacent and hypotenuse. So if our triangle has something about adjacent and hypotenuse, we're going to use the cosine button. And the third one is tangent, and that looks like opposite and adjacent. So if we look here, a trig ratio compares the lengths of the sides of a right triangle with a given angle. So if we know the angle and a side, we can calculate the other sides. And if we know two of the sides, we can determine the angle from the lesson we had before, because there's just no other way to build that right angle triangle if you're going to have those two things that are the same. So that's why it's important to label this guy correctly. Wait a minute. Does trig have something to do with these calculator buttons? Yepper. So on your scientific calculator, you'll have buttons sine, cosine, and tangent. And I just want to highlight the buttons here, sine, cosine, and tangent. They basically correspond to what it is that we're talking about on the triangle. So if we've picked the trig ratio because of the information from our triangle, we just have to use the right button, and then we'll get it. Also, I'm going to point out here this sine with a -1, cosine with a -1, and tangent with a -1. That'll be important in the last lesson when we talk about finding the angle of a triangle. Right now in this lesson, we're worried about finding the sides, so we're going to be okay. So what do the trig buttons do? They convert an angle into a decimal, so it can be used to find the length of a side. Or we can convert a decimal with a trig key into an angle. So the trig keys are really converter keys. Okay, so step one, if we remember that, was to label the triangle. Step two was to choose the right ratio. Step three, do the math. Well, let's go to the next video for an example of how to find a side or an angle using trig.